Drama Part 4. In Dark Age Drama Part 4, we will look at why Alfred became the only English king ever called the Great, and how Anglo-Saxon England defied the Dark Age description of complete lack of cultural advancement. In the words of Bernard Cornwell, Uhtred may not like Alfred much. King is too pious, too humorless, and too organized for Uhtred's taste. But Alfred will change the world. He was indeed great. But what did Alfred do to deserve this title? Nothing less than the preservation of English identity, language, and culture. Alfred was first called the Great, or Magnus in Latin, by the medieval historian Matthew Paris, about 1250. Ironically, at about the same time as the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson was writing down the Viking myths in Old Norse. Reformation writers such as John Foxe also called Alfred the Great in the 16th century, and it became a historical tradition. English history did not start at the Norman Conquest. Why start from 1066? To do so ignores the ancient Britons, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, and Vikings. The only thing that began at the Norman Conquest was the regnal numbering of kings. So William of Normandy, also known as William the Bastard, became William I. Previously, English kings had been identified by descriptive titles. For example, there had been 3 Edwards: Edward the Elder, Edward the Martyr, and Edward the Confessor. But did the Dark Age end in 1066? The Normans' version of the feudal system was severe, because it had to support 2 very expensive forms of warfare. First, mounted men-at-arms, also known as knights, and second, castles. Unlike the burhs, which were places of last resort, castles were highly effective in controlling land and the local population. Note the castle in the background of this illustration of medieval agriculture. The Normans could quickly throw up a motte and bailey castle. This was a mound with a fort on top. In fact, it was one of the first things they did when they landed in 1066. Feudal systems involved grants of land in return for acts of service. These were usually either goods or fully trained and equipped soldiers. The land generated the wealth to pay for them. Under the Normans, slavery was abolished, but serfdom continued. The Normans also imposed an additional layer of nobility on top of the existing Anglo-Saxon hierarchy. All in all, a strange way to turn back the dark. By 1066, England had been a single kingdom with a common language for over 100 years. It had a unitary coinage, unlike in most of Europe, where local authorities issued their own coins. It was Alfred who had the vision of a united England over 150 years before William the Conqueror. The Last Kingdom series is a fictional account of how England was united. In the original book series by Bernard Cornwell, Uhtred gives credit to the burhs as the cornerstones of Alfred's resistance to the Danes. They were not only places of refuge, they were also centres of trade and commerce. Alfred's resistance to the Danes upheld law and order against anarchy. Trade, law, and order helped the parts of England under Alfred and his heirs' control to prosper. England was becoming a rich, unified country, a real plum. Alfred was real. Uhtred, son of Uhtred, the warrior hero, is fictional. Ragnar and the Ragnarsons are based on legend. England was stronger because the Anglo-Saxon kingdom's weakness had been their failure to unite against a common threat. Northumbria, divided by rival rulers Aella and Osbert, had been the first to fall to the invaders. Then East Anglia and half of Mercia, Middle Anglia. This left Wessex as the Last Kingdom. By the time Uhtred gets to Wessex, Alfred had been fighting the Danes for years. Alfred not only preserved English as an identity based upon a common language, but he also championed English as a written culture. This gave him what we might call a technological advantage, because with literacy came numeracy, that is to say, better accounting. Alfred commissioned the first history of England in English. It was called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It took the form of a manuscript which began in Alfred's capital, Winchester. Then it was passed from monastery to monastery, where it was copied. Additional local detail might be added to each copy, but it tells how the English defeated the Danish invaders and won back the rest of England. The common language Alfred preserved is now known as Old English. It was spoken by rich and poor alike, although it had several different dialects. Uhtred, a Northumbrian, does not speak like the West Saxons. When he meets him, the British or Welsh monk Asser says, "Your voice, you are from Northumbria," in The Pale Horseman, Book 2 of the original series. Alfred was the champion of English written culture, as opposed to the oral culture of his enemies the Danes. Their sagas had to be learned so they could be recited by skalds or court poets. They survived because they were written down later. Alfred also favoured written records such as the Burgle Heidage. This was an administrative document which shows how his successful defence against the Danes was organised. It itemised how many men and how much land was required to man the burhs. This English written culture continued under his successors, including laws and bookkeeping, which made tax collection more effective. The epic poem Beowulf was originally a Nordic saga, but it has survived because it was translated and written down in Old English. It became the masterpiece of Old English literature. It is doubly ironic that it was written down not long after the year 1000, when England was part of the North Sea Empire of the Danish king Canute. Alfred's cultural achievement survived subsequent events, but it also defies the Dark Age definition of lack of cultural advancement. His biographer, Bishop Asser, presented him as the ideal but practical Christian ruler. He was a champion of law as well as a defender of the Christian faith. Much of common law comes from the Anglo-Saxons, for example, trial by jury. The law was for both Saxon and Dane. The Treaty of Wedmore specified the same blood price for Saxon and Dane. In 890, Alfred had the laws written down as a collection known as the Doom Book. The Anglo-Saxons had been becoming Christians since 495, when the King of Wessex was baptized. By the time of Vikings Valhalla, Norsemen were also becoming Christian. King Canute was a third-generation Christian. Alfred upheld the church, which preserved learning through the monasteries. In an age when everything was handwritten, the monastery scriptoria was where culture was both preserved and advanced. There were also schools which trained clergy and clerics, or clerks. Their students became good administrators. Even Norse kingdoms such as Denmark and Norway wanted them. But the monasteries were prime targets for raiders. This highlights further religious and cultural differences between Norse and Anglo-Saxon. It was anarchic warlords versus law and order. The pagan Norse also took advantage of Christian holidays to attack York at Christmas in 867 and Chippenham in 878. In The Pale Horseman, Uhtred regards Alfred as a weakly scholar, but even the warrior recognized the value of being able to read and write. Years before Uhtred meets him, Alfred had led a charge at a battle in 871, which won him fame as the Boar of Ashdown. But Alfred was much more than just a warlord. His breadth of vision recognized that a kingdom strong enough to survive needed wealth and learning. In practice, this meant a single coinage and effective administration. His heirs followed his example by making England into such a rich prize that it became the target not just for raids but full-scale invasion. After Alfred and Uhtred, England fell to foreign conquerors, but it remained a prosperous single country with its own language, culture, and identity. By the time of the Norman conquest, Old English was the only vernacular or common language in Europe used for both art and administration, at least 200 years before the Renaissance could produce anything comparable. In comparison, the Norman conquerors spoke Norman French and used Latin for art and administration. Alfred not only commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in English, he also had many texts translated from Latin into English, including the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People and the Hexateuch, the first 6 books of the Bible. The Old English language outlasted the Normans. Another comparison is that the Anglo-Saxon chronicles were written in English, but the equivalent history of the Normans was written in Latin. The Bayeux Tapestry was a spectacular record of the Normans' victory over the English, but its captions are in Latin. Although it was commissioned by the Bishop of Bayeux, it may have been made in England. For example, the style of its figures is similar to those in the Hexateuch. The Old English language merged with Danish, Norman French, and the Latin of the Church to become Middle English, the language of Chaucer. Middle English would evolve into early modern English via the language of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. This evolution was begun by Alfred the Great. Thank you for watching.